Well, I mean, it's also really interesting to me that, for example, on Facebook, very often when you, type in one of those hot links, and so forth, and there isn't a page associated with that person or topic, it's the Wikipedia page that will come up. And similarly in Google, the Wikipedia pages rank incredibly highly, I guess expectedly, because it's one of the top 10 websites in the world, but also kind of get this special treatment, right, in Google, as if it were more authoritative.
Right.
Right. So it goes quite a bit beyond Wikipedia, the giant, social media apparatus, the search engine that most people use globally.
Sure. I mean, Apple, for example, will push Wikipedia articles when you ask it certain kinds of questions. Wikipedia has been, I don't know if it still is today, but they've been used as sort of background articles beneath YouTube videos. Sure. And yes, clearly it's pushed a lot by Google. To what extent that is a policy of the corporation as opposed to just a reflection of how their algorithms work, I'm not going to opine, but it probably doesn't matter very much.
Right.
So, yeah.
So there's, I guess what I'm getting at is there's a lot of the Wikipedia perspective is a very powerful and wide-reaching perspective.
Yep.
And that has a profound impact, it seems to me, on how we understand the truth around us and knowledge and everything else.
So Wikipedia has been constructing its own reality for a long time. It's sharing an establishment reality today, but it wasn't always. Back in 2006, Stephen Colbert famously coined a term, wikiality, right? And I don't think he was that happy with Wikipedia at the time. He was mocking it, and a lot of people were mocking it because it was a new thing, and everybody thought it was weird that there was this thing called an encyclopedia that anybody could edit, which was true back then. It really isn't true today. I don't know that Stephen Colbert really liked some of the perspectives that he was seeing in Wikipedia at the time, because it was more neutral back then. I have a feeling that Stephen Colbert likes wikiality now. I'd like to ask him that.
So, but the question about having, basically the argument here is that the attempt at having a successful open source or open content encyclopedia seems to have failed. You're making that claim. I'm
not saying that they're all doomed to failure, not by any...
Okay, not necessarily all.
No.
Okay.
Why think so? Yeah. I think that what we have learned is that Wikipedia is and always was going to be centralized, simply because it's a single website and has one article on each topic. It was always going to be difficult, at the very least, for such a resource to fairly represent all points of view. What ought to exist, essentially, is a new kind of network that reaches out and brings together articles on the same topic from lots of different sources and makes them equally available, perhaps similarly formatted, but it needs to be a decentralized sort of network. In other words, I'm not talking about a new project, a new platform, right, that could be dominated by some new group. I'm talking about a truly decentralized, leaderless, centerless network, kind of like blogs. Together, they make a thing called the blogosphere, right? And one reason why there is no Jimmy Wales or Mark Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey of the blogosphere is that it uses a standard. It's a technical standard that allows anybody with a blog to take their blogging data and move it somewhere else to a different platform or whatever.
RSS, right, is what you're talking about here?
What's that?
You're talking about RSS here?
That's correct. I'm talking about RSS and Atom. That's really essential so the existence of that technical standard is essential to the blogosphere being as decentralized, that's the word, as it is. So I think basically there ought to be a standard for encyclopedias. Perhaps there should be standards for other categories of content, right? And then we should make it easy to distribute encyclopedic content according to that standard. Then we can imagine lots of different apps essentially aggregating the content from different sources and having multiple different collections of encyclopedia articles, all of them being, to get back to your question, open content, right? So there's no reason, there's nothing about an open source or open content encyclopedia that is doomed to failure. It's just this particular dominant instance of the idea. In 20 years, I think possibly Wikipedia will be just one of many influential encyclopedias that are all interlinked and made available according to a common standard.
Here's the question, right? And this is where I think we all get stuck, right? For example, we have had this proliferation of fact checkers, right?
Yeah.
Which has its own, series of big issues. I mean, an example being, I remember our documentary from early 2020, which talked about the potential of a lab origin for coronavirus, or CCP virus, as we call it at New York Times. That was fact-checked on Facebook, but it turned out that the person doing the fact-checking was actually associated with the Wuhan lab. But the thing that people want to know, right, is how much value can I put on a particular source as to the veracity of the information, or at least even the perspective of the information. And that's the challenge, right? So some people say, well, all this stuff over here, as Wikipedia editors, all this stuff over here, we're not listening to that because that's a perspective we don't respect, right? We accept these sources because these sources we respect. And someone else might have a completely different perspective. So in this sort of very, very loose aggregation, how can someone simply... Most people don't want to have to go into the nuance of all these things.
Right.
They want to be able to come and say, okay, so I want to get a reasonable assessment of this topic, a reasonable perspective or series of perspectives.
Yeah.
How can I really trust that today?
So there's different ways to solve that problem. And the organization that I started last year to tackle this project to create standards for encyclopedias has been working with a certain concept that there would also be ratings standards as well. So anyone could publish their own ratings of various articles. What I imagine is, for example, the American Medical Association identifying all of their members and essentially weighting the ratings that their members give of different articles and using those together to create a selection of the best articles on medical topics online. So it becomes a sort of decentralized way of peer review. And of course, a similar sort of system can be generalized and could be used by anyone, not just the American Medical Association. It's just an example. I imagine that there would have to be something like white lists in order to keep people honest. You don't want people to game this sort of system. So, as I say, probably there would have to be white lists of approved, respected people, but different people would make their own white lists, essentially, right? And then share those lists. So there would be not just ratings of articles, but then there would be meta ratings of the raters, I guess. It's just an idea. There's other ways of variants on that idea. One thing that I want to exist, that the Knowledge Standards Foundation is going to develop, is a reader for encyclopedias, for the encyclosphere, as it's called. And this would collect articles from all over the web. Now, we don't want to publish our own reader, by the way. We just want to make the software and let other people make their own readers. We don't want to actually get into the business of that. We just want to supply the tools. So you can imagine readers that collect articles from lots of different sources, and then a particular reader's selections of articles can be published as a resource for people to use. Well, the National Geographic has published its list of approved articles, and they aren't all from Britannica or from National Geographic itself or from Wikipedia. They actually are from all kinds of different sources. The thing that would make this possible, as I was saying, is that all of those articles would have a common format. Right? That's actually the thing that it's a little thing, right? It's just a technical detail almost, but it would enable these sorts of representations of knowledge to draw from a common pool, a common knowledge repository that spans the entire world, every point of view, all nationalities. So.
Yeah. And frankly, this is quite fascinating, because I think I was thinking to myself as you were describing this that, this seems to be having all the same trappings of Wikipedia until you mentioned that, basically all this, it's kind of like a metaverse, of, so to speak, of these different rating structures and so forth. And then it suddenly starts making sense, because the cream might actually rise to the top among the people who are actually seeking to get a reasonable perspective on the world.
Right. And right away, too, if a Nobel Prize winner writes an article and just happens to put it on his blog and doesn't bother trying to get it published by some academic encyclopedia or whatever, but if it happens to be the best thing written online, it shouldn't be buried down in the Google results. It should shoot right up to the top as soon as enough people who have, credible opinions on the subject decide that it belongs there. So, and of course, again, there can be different groups of people with completely different notions of what the truth is or what the best article on a subject would be. And you can easily imagine how a selection of the best articles from an American conservative point of view would be very different from like a Chinese communist point of view. And it might be very interesting to compare them side by side and see how they differ. So I'd like to create the system whereby we can start thinking of all the world's encyclopedias and all the world's encyclopedia articles as part of a common pool, right? I'd like to challenge Wikipedia also. Why the hell are you not actually allowing people to write more than one article per topic? Isn't there a need for that? You really think there isn't a need for that right now? Seriously? That's ridiculous.
So how would you know which article to go to in this model that you're proposing?
Right, okay. That was your earlier question. I think people would, it'd be like the internet is now. It is, it's the same problem. There's the massive fire hose of information coming at you, and there's lots of different ways to solve that problem, right? You can trust particular brands. You can trust editors and to select the articles for you. I'd like to create a system that supports all different solutions to that problem, right? I don't want Google deciding for me, though. That's for damn sure.
That's right. I was going to say, you can come watch American Thought Leaders and find out what Larry Sanger thinks. I mean, you do have a solution. And that what's interesting about your solution is that it's not fully baked. Like, this is something that you're actually working on developing the standards for. And I thought this was really interesting, because figuring these sorts of things out actually takes time and insight and, you know, discourse and arguing, and it's messy, right? I guess it's kind of democratic in a way, and messy that way.
I'm glad you say that. It's very important. It's a point is near and dear to my heart, because I regret not doing certain things when I was starting Wikipedia. I look at Wikipedia as missed opportunity, and certain problems with it are my fault. Like, I could have pushed a lot harder for a more of a democratic decision-making process, and I didn't. I just didn't try to solve that problem in the project's first year. And there are other things as well. So I think it's really important that there be an organization like the Knowledge Standards Foundation that has a forum in which we sit down with a lot of different experts and we think through exactly what we want to do. We try to get the encyclopedia publishers and the general public on the same page. The basic ideas perhaps aren't going to change very much. I mean, we know that we want a decentralized network. That's true. That's part of the unchangeable core idea. And also, we know for sure that there isn't going to be a central editorial apparatus that pushes a bias. But there's lots of different variables that need to be considered. And frankly, I'm very worried that if this is such a great idea, that it too might end up being, you know, captured by the establishment in various ways. And so one of the questions that we're going to be taking up in the next years really, is how do we prevent that from happening? You know, how do you keep it decentralized? Not just make it decentralized in the beginning. How do you guarantee that it stays that way, constitutionally, as it were?
Well, I mean, it's a fascinating question. You know, as we're discussing now, I'm thinking to myself, you know, Wikipedia, Google, Facebook, these are actually websites that, you know, dominate the whole internet, the World Wide Web, right? And they're the entry points for so many people globally for almost all of their information. And they've gone in a particular ideological way, right?
Yep.
And so how can, you know, these small initiatives in the face of, you know, limitless money and audience, and how can they hope to pierce that somehow?
Yeah. That's a good question. It's hard. I think that ultimately it is possible for newer, better ideas to win. That's how the internet was built, right? That's what people said about Wikipedia itself. How can you possibly take down Britannica? How could you go head-to-head with them? Especially because when we were launching, Britannica had made its content free. They locked it down and put it behind a paywall later on. Yeah, it's daunting, but as I see it, just look at what we are proposing. So we're going to be putting all of the encyclopedic content in the world in a single network. That's an extremely compelling vision. It's easy to do. The technical problems aren't hard to solve. We just need to do the work. It's easy in the sense that we understand how it would work. It's not easy in the sense that it could be done overnight. It couldn't. But all of those open content encyclopedias, they will be included in the system, whether they want to or not, because they declared themselves open content. But we're going to be working with them. I actually had a meeting with 5 encyclopedias. You can find it on YouTube, actually, last Monday. And that was very thought-provoking, a lot of fun, and we look forward to working with more of them. We just combine their content and their resources in something that is bigger than the whole and better because it is like the superset of all encyclopedias. I don't really see how Wikipedia can compete with that, especially when Wikipedia is just part of the same network. Because we're going to do the same thing to Wikipedia. We're going to put the content of Wikipedia in the same format and make it just as easily available to app writers to make their own encyclopedia apps.
As I was preparing for our interview today, you, I guess it's about a year ago, you published a book of your essays. Briefly tell me what you're trying to accomplish with this book. I think it's just as relevant today as it was a year ago, frankly.
Right, so it's called Essays on Free Knowledge. I view the ability to publish and to work together online as one of the most revolutionary ideas and opportunities that humankind has had to develop our resources ever, really. And I still think that's true, but there's a lot of hard thinking that needs to be done about all the policies that go into making that a reality, a proper reality. So I talk about the lessons learned from Wikipedia. I give the history of it. I have a couple of essays about neutrality because that's such an important part of a free collaborative encyclopedia, or any encyclopedia, frankly, I think. And then I talk also in a different section of the book about the importance of staying true to the ideals of knowledge when knowledge becomes so easy, or information rather becomes so easy. We live in an age of info light, and this has been the case since the beginning of the internet. It's a perennial problem, and it will continue to be a problem. And it has implications for not just how we build our encyclopedias and like what sort of policies we should adopt there, but also how we educate kids, you know. Have dusty old books written by white men become irrelevant in 2021? Well, no, actually. All of the old arguments for a liberal arts education, right, remain perfectly valid. So I go into that. And then in the last section, I sort of bring those topics up to date. I reprint something that's actually free to read on my website, Declaration of Digital Independence, in which I talk about how big tech has essentially violated systematically rights to free speech and autonomy and privacy. We need to move in the direction of decentralized content networks if we want to fight back against them. And decentralized social media. I introduced the idea of encyclosphere there, so I have something to read about that. And then finally, I have a sort of retrospective analysis of what the problems were that led to the information disaster that we're now in today. I think we were naive. We were incredibly naive to give up our private information to the likes of Mark Zuckerberg. We didn't think hard enough. People who knew, well, we should have listened closer to them. They should have been given bigger platforms. It should have been made a much a much bigger deal. But no, instead, these centralizing corporations were enabled to get into a position where they could dominate us. And that's a terrible problem today. And so I talk again about what the solution to that is. And again, it's about decentralization, but decentralization is just a technical gloss on the notion of power to the people, basically. So for information to be decentralized means that it's scattered in the hands of many different independently operating entities, individuals and organizations, right? That's power to the people. That's technical power to the people. So that's the solution. We need a democratic revolution in tech.
Any final thoughts before we finish up?
Yeah, well, if you are interested in like keeping abreast of the developments, then I would have you go to Encyclosphere, just like it sounds, encyclosphere.org. And there's a sign-up form there just to get general info about the Encyclosphere project and also about the seminar, which goes into more depth. And we're going to have a video series and discussions about important policy questions and so forth. I'd push people in that direction. We're also going to try to do the same thing for social media. That's something we haven't talked about, but we actually have a WordPress plugin that allows people to publish their social media feeds via WordPress. You'll own your own posts, and then you can push them out to Twitter and to other sources. And the next version actually is going to have feeds, incorporate feeds from lots of people that you're following. You'll be able to follow people who have this similar setups on WordPress. We'll also be able to subscribe to Twitter feeds and Instagram feeds and the rest of that, and all within the comfort of your own blog, essentially, but a blog that has been transformed into a social media platform that you own. So that basically is going to decentralize social media. And if we don't do it, somebody's got to do that, because that's another huge problem. So decentralization is the answer as far as I'm concerned.
Well, Larry Sanger, it's such a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you.
The Wikimedia Foundation did not immediately respond to our request for comment.